So we'll continue now with our study of the Republic. This time, continuing in Book 4. We did the beginning of Book 4 last time when we saw the completion of the story of the education of the Guardians, and now I want to turn to the next segment of their conversation. So I'm only going to read a few pages of Book 4 here. We're going to go from 427D to 434B. And so recall that this conversation about the city began. It began initially because of Glaucon's question. Can you do a better job, Socrates, of convincing me of the thing you thought you convinced Thrasymachus of, or whatever, about the idea that we should be just. And they talked about that for a while, and that led to this idea that maybe it would be easier to grasp what justice is in a person if we could see it first in a city. And so they thought, okay, let's look at the beginnings of the city. And so then they started giving account of the city. No, well, that's mostly what we've been talking about. Well, that's in fact everything we've been doing so far has really been working through that account of the building up of the city. We've noticed that that it's not, their conversation hasn't been just a straightforward thing. I've been emphasizing these sort of conversational twists and turns that have resulted in the conversation changing its direction, or obscurities or confusions or errors being built into the conversation or whatever. So, the conversation has gone all over the place in different ways. Anyway, we got to the end of that when they said, okay, now the city's set up. We've founded our city. So we got to the end of that last time. And so that part of their conversation is now done. Socrates started saying, okay, let's say where a city comes from. Started with his derivation, then got wrapped up in a description of the city nowadays, then got wrapped up with Adeimantus in a prescription for the education of the Guardians and so on. But that's taken us to the end of our story of the city. So he says, okay, we got our city now let's talk about it. So now he moves on to the next thing. And so the reason we did that, according to the conversation in Book 2, was to be able to see justice in it. And so now this next little part of our conversation here for 427D to 434B is going to be addressing that thing. So he begins there at 427D. He says, okay, in the next place, get a light, call everybody in, and see whether we can somehow see where justice might be and where just injustice is here. So they're launching that next part of the conversation. So Socrates then says, okay, so Socrates says, you guys should do this. And they say, no, you got to do it, right? So he says, let's hope we'll find it in this way. He says, I suppose our city, if it has been correctly founded, is perfectly good. Maybe. That's going to be their starting hypothesis. Let's imagine we have a good city. And then they say yes. And so then here's the next thing Socrates says. Okay, plainly then it's wise, courageous, moderate, and just. Where did that come from? Like, it's reasonable. Those are all nice things, and it makes sense to say that that's what it would be. But where did the idea come from that those would be the things you would pick out as the relevant components or constituents of the good? There's no account, no justification of that given here. Again, that doesn't mean it's not right or it's not worthwhile, but there's a move there that is just made without real explanation. And then the reason I'm emphasizing this is because there's some trickiness here, some errors, I think, here that you should be thinking through as a person who's trying to do philosophy, right? And so then Socrates says, okay, well, so we got these four: wise, courageous, moderate, and just. And Socrates says, isn't it the case that whichever of them we happen to find will leave as the remainder what hasn't been found? Maybe. I'm not sure if it's always the case that any time you can think of four, they're simply four discrete units, such that if you take one away, the remainder is always three. Like, that works when you say, is 4 minus 1 3? Yes. But I don't know that means any time you find four, you take away one, the three will be remaining. Like, if you say John is a student and he's a brother, and he's a nice guy, and he's 4 feet tall or whatever, right? If you say let's take away John the student, doesn't that leave the rest? No, like you took away everything, right? So, if you really took me away, you took away the guy who was also all those other things too, right? So, how you construe your four matters to knowing, whether this is the kind of thing you can take one away from or whatever. Anyway, and so then Socrates says, just as with any other four things, probably not any other, if we were seeking any one of them in something or other and recognized it first, that would be enough for us. And if we recognize the other three first, then that would suffice for the recognition of the thing looked for. Well, okay, it would be true, I think, if and only if you had four things that exhaustively and exclusively defined a domain, and if those four things were each completely unique and separate from each other, then I think it's true that if you took three away, what would be left would be the fourth. And in that case, you would be able to say, oh, there it is, and you'd be able to recognize it, right? So I can think of an example, a very precise example, where this description is true. But I imagine that in most cases when you're talking about four things, that's not the case. Like if you say, I want to learn melody and harmony and rhythm and tone. That's what I want to get under control in my guitar playing. If you learn some stuff about rhythm and you learn some stuff about harmony and you learn some stuff about tone, does that mean you can say, okay, now I get it, that's melody? I don't think so. I think melody is a unique kind of reality, and even if you knew what rhythm and harmony and tone were, you wouldn't automatically know. You couldn't deduce what melody is from that, or you have to have experienced melody to have some sense of what it is. Or if you know what rhythm and harmony and melody are, I don't know that you know what tone or timbre is. So I don't know that it is true. In fact, I think it isn't true that usually if you just find three things, you know what the fourth is. So again, I'm not saying this exactly to say that what they're going to do is wrong or anything. I just think this initial discussion presents itself as giving a sensible method, and I think the things that are said are clearly not compelling. But Glaucon and Adeimantus are like, yep, go with that. And it's going to recur. They're going to keep reverting back to this point throughout this ensuing discussion. And in some cases, I think it doesn't matter that much, or at least not for my purposes. At the end, when the point they're going to finally get to, I think it is going to be kind of significant that they're wrong here. Actually, let me just say one thing about it. Like, if you say, well, if you find any three, then you're going to know what the fourth one is. Like, but really the question is, why did you pick those four? And I don't see why they are exhaustive. Earlier in the conversation in Book 3, for example, they've mentioned other good things. They've talked about piety. I think they talked about something like generosity. There are lots of things you might name that are, good qualities. So yeah, there is wisdom, there is moderation, there is courage, there is justice, yeah. But what about the other things that we think of as characteristics of something that's good, right? Because he listed those because he said, the city would be perfectly good, so it would have these four. Well, why did you pick those four? Why didn't you pick three or four or five or six other things too? And I think that's where the possible things that would have been excluded would be worth thinking about. Nonetheless, there is a lot of sense to why they picked these three, and some of that becomes clear as we read through this. But so they're going to go through now, and they're going to talk about each of these ones. They're going to talk first about wisdom, then about courage, then about moderation, then about justice, and each one goes on for a page or two. So they're quite digestible things, and there's a lot of good stuff in it. So now I want to take up each of those, and I want to take these things up as pretty sensible and powerful things to say about politics. So, we were way back, we were looking at the constitution of the Spartans and the Athenians. We've been talking about the founding of the city here in Book 2. I think that here you're getting some really insightful bits of political, philosophical reflection on those realities, mixed up with some confusing bits of conversation. But the four basic points that are made here, I think, are quite quite strong and quite worthy of your deep philosophical consideration. So, first of all, then Socrates talks about wisdom. And he says, a good city is going to be wise. Now, what would that mean? What would it mean to refer to wisdom as something in the city? Right? I mean, I guess I should even stop right there. They said at the beginning, aren't we going to be better off seeing justice in the city, and then we could see it in the person? That kind of makes sense with justice, because we think of justice as, we call a state's acts just or unjust. That's an unjust war or something like that. So justice does seem to be a word that we kind of naturally apply to political actions. And in some ways, it's not a word we so directly apply to persons. We do think you should do things that are just, but we more often, when we talk about people, I think, talk about things like goodness and so on. Not exclusively, but I guess I think of justice as a word that does more often refer to a political context and not to a personal. But he says, we're going to talk about justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation. Well, wisdom, courage, and moderation, it's pretty rare, I think, that we use those words to talk about cities and politics. We use those to talk about persons. So I think there's a real question here, which is a model for which? It might make sense to say we would look for justice in the city first before looking at justice in a person. It might make sense. But I would have thought it would make more sense to look for wisdom and courage and moderation in a person first before looking at this at them in a city, in the sense that they are more primarily realities of persons, and we could sort of see by analogy what we might mean to describe them of the city. Right? But in any case, that's not what they're doing. And that's actually not what he initially said he was going to do. He said he was going to look for justice in the city, but now we're looking at all of these, right? But in any case, he says, well, the city we described is going to be wise, in my opinion, right? Because we're saying it's good, so it's going to have all these things. So you should think, okay, what would it mean to talk about a wise city, or perhaps more exactly to talk about wisdom in the city, or something like that? And then he says it. He says, that's because it's of good counsel, eublos. And I think that's a good thought. That's a helpful thought, right? That we can talk, to put it in perhaps what I would think of as a more correct or exact formulation, we could say cities can be governed or organized or run wisely. Anyway, but it's of good counsel. And then it says, okay, well, wisdom is a kind of knowledge, episteme, because it's by knowledge that men counsel well. But then he says there's lots of different kinds of knowledge in the city, right? And that's we saw that there's a lot of knowledge in the city. That in a way the city is kind of constituted by knowledge, because the city is what happens when these different arts come together, right? When the practitioners of different arts bring their abilities together, and the city is defined by that division of labor. So yes, people are laboring in the sense of working, but the relevant thing is they're working in a way that's guided by an art, by knowledge, right? So the civilization, in a way, is defined by the knowledge. So we already saw that there were all of these knowledges here. So he says, well, what is wise counsel? Is it one of those? And the point is, no. It is itself a different knowing than just farming and so on. And Socrates says, what about this? Is there in the city we just founded a kind of knowledge belonging to some of the citizens that counsels not about the affairs connected with some particular thing in the city, like how much flour you should put in that cake you're baking or something like that, but about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and the other cities? Now that's there it seems like a very important thing has been defined. A kind of knowledge definitive of cities, which is a knowledge of it as a whole, and with respect to it as a whole, an orientation towards how it is best for it to deal with itself and with other cities. That seems to me to have now pretty much defined what we might call government. And so being of wise counsel, being of good counsel, in a sense, being wise would mean being of good government, having government making good decisions about how the city should deal with itself and deal with others. And it seems to me he's right. That's not the same as farming. That's not the same as being a blacksmith, right? It seems that he's rightly saying we need to recognize, and he's here defining a distinctive and essential dimension of a society. So going back to what he was doing when he was talking in Book 2 and initially starting to derive a society, he was laying these things out, and this seems like a kind of proper part of that story. That in addition to the city being just the coming together of farmer and shoemaker and whatever else, the city is also defined by that kind of knowledge or that kind of perspective that is the orientation to the city as such. Right? You might call it the self-consciousness of the city, the orientation towards what the city is and what it as a whole needs to do to handle itself as a city. And and as he says, that's going to be how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and other cities. How would it deal with itself? Like, you could think about many of the issues involved there. I mean, and we're now basically thinking about governance. But among other things, that means how those other things in the city, blacksmith and carpenter, are going to relate to each other, right? And it's probably going to have to do with distribution of resources, all kinds of things. So that thing, how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and the other cities, that seems like a powerful description of a kind of knowledge, a distinctive kind of knowledge that wouldn't exist anywhere except in the city, and that is essential to making a city be a city. And that I would call it knowledge. And there surely is knowledge involved in it, no question about it. But because you got to know what's going on in the city and so on. But it's a kind of knowledge that really powerfully involves judgment. I mean, as do many other kinds of knowledge, how to make good shoes, how to make good food. But it seems really relevant here, since governing a city or is really going to be about, what is best. Like, it's really about values in a pretty powerful way. In any case, that can be handled well or poorly, and so he's calling wisdom in the city being of good counsel with respect to that. And anyway, Glaucon agrees to this, and Socrates says, okay, what is it? What and in whom is it? And Glaucon says, it's the guardian's skill. Socrates didn't say that. He asked Glaucon, so it's really always, it seems to me, important to remember who says what. So it's worth remembering that Socrates never did say this. And maybe there is going to be a little bit of significance to that later, but maybe we won't care about it. In any case, Glaucon's answer seems pretty good. It's the guardian's skill. Yeah, this in a way defines what the real job of the guardians is. Remember, we said before, I quoted you that line, was early in Book 3, right? That the distinctive thing about the guardians is that they're the craftsmen of the city's freedom, right? So remember, being a guardian was going to be a particular craft. And there it turned out it was supposed to be of the city's freedom. And then we talked about that as caring for and loving it, the city. That came at the end of Book 4. And now we're saying, yes, this is the guardian's skill to be responsible for knowing about the city as a whole, what would be best for it in dealing with itself and with others. And so we've now really defined this thing. And at this point, it's pretty clear that the things that would then fit that description of guardians are what we said at the end of Book 4, will be the government, not the soldiers, right? They're the auxiliaries. So yes, Glaucon says it's the guardian's skill, and it's in those rulers whom we have just named perfect guardians. Right? So then they move on next to talk about courage. And so he says, okay, next, courage, both itself as well as where it's in this city that we need to find. And he says, it doesn't seem like it's hard to see. I wonder if it's a little more complicated than they play out here, but nonetheless, once again, I think a pretty powerful point is going to be made here. And I think, and this is going to relate pretty directly to that issue of that splitting up of the guardians into the guardians properly speaking and their auxiliaries, where initially we thought it was just soldiers, right? Well, that's going to come up here. So Socrates said, well, who would say a city is cowardly or courageous while looking to any part other than the one that defends it and takes the field on its behalf? And Glaucon says there's no one who would look to anything else. Well, actually, I think I would, and I actually suspect Socrates would too. So that question that Socrates asked could have been answered differently. It was not an assertion, but we have that first part. We certainly could think: does it make sense to define something like courage, which, as I said, seems to be a term that better describes an individual person than a city? But is there something like what I would think of as courage in a person that describes a city? And that would pertain to the part that defends it. Like it does make sense that the issues of courage would have to do with the city's conduct in warfare and so on. So that makes some sense. And Socrates says, okay, I don't suppose then that whether the other men in it, besides those who take the field in battle, are cowardly or courageous, that would be decisive for its being courageous or not. Yeah, well, I actually think quite the opposite. I think that's really what would be the more relevant thing to look at. But whether or not this is a perfect discussion of courage, I think something is really rightly being defined here. There's something about a city where we're recognizing, again, as we have already, the essential role of something like force, military force. And we can say there's a way that could be working better or worse, right? So we're defining something like the good functioning of that part. And it makes sense that, under the broad heading of courage, we're gonna maybe first name this thing, which is the effective functioning of the forceful arm of it. It's actually, I think, the thing that they go on to that's even better. So Socrates said, okay, when we were talking about wisdom in the city, it seemed like that was the something that attaches to a part of the city, namely the governing body. I have reasons to challenge that too later, but for the moment, he just says that thing. And he says, so similarly here too, it seems like courage we're attaching to a part, the ones that go and defend it. So he says, so a city is also courageous by a part of itself, thanks to that part's having in it a power that through everything will preserve the opinion about which things are denos, terrible. That they are the same ones and of the same sort as the lawgiver transmitted in the education. Or don't you call that courage? And then Glaucon wants some further explanation. And then Socrates mostly just repeats itself. He says he's talking about the preserving of the opinion produced by law through education about what and what sort of thing is there. Bloom is translating it terrible. It's the word denos that we saw in Sophocles' Antinomy about wonders. I'm going to come back to that. So he said here, he's defined courage, and I think in an excellent and interesting way, right? Courage is the preservation of opinion about what things are terrible. So think about that in a personal context, which it seems to me makes some sort of more sense. We really do call someone courageous when they are exactly like Socrates described himself and so on after his speech to Miletus. He said, what matters is not whether you live or die. What matters is what you live or die for, right? What you take a stand on. So courage is preserving your sense of what really matters, so that confronted with death, you don't say, oh, living or dying, that's the only thing that really matters, and you let go of your sense of those other things that were important, like being good or protecting someone or whatever else, Courage is, on the contrary, when you say, no, the thing that really matters is that I stand up for what's good, or that I protect these people, or whatever. So yeah, death is coming. I don't want that. But it is not more important than this thing I'm standing up for. These are the things that matter, not this, right? And so courage is preserving that opinion about what the things are that matter, and being able to preserve it in difficult circumstances, indeed with the confrontation with death. Now, yes, it's true that soldiers in war are going to have to die because they're going to preserve their sense that what matters is the city, let's say, right? Remember, that's what Pericles said in the funeral oration, right? They thought it was the city mattered enough that they were prepared to die for it, right? And so on. important and interesting point. So we can see a way in which we might say the soldiers are courageous, and if you've got a lot of courageous soldiers, then that means that the army's going to be defending a good thing. And if you have a government that's a wise council and knows what's good about dealing with itself, with other cities, it's going to make good decisions about what to go to war about and so on. So you can see how that does apply to the soldiers in war. But as I said before, I'm one of those people who wouldn't have thought, as Glaucon does, that this can only apply to soldiers. Indeed, I would have thought it might more strongly apply to something like the governing body and their handling of laws. Like, does this governing body, not the soldiers, but the governing body, do they hold true to what really matters? Or are they bribed off by pharmaceutical companies and arms contractors and whatever else, where they think, oh yeah, money, that's what really matters? The people who need to preserve the opinion about what is Denos, what matters, I would be more concerned about that, I think, in what they called the perfect guardians, the government as such, rather than in the soldiers. So we already heard that soldiers they'll die for whatever it is they think they're supposed to die for. They die for what's familiar, right? That's what we learned back in Book 2, and we've seen repeated. They're like dogs, guard dogs, right? They fight for the side they're on, and they oppose the other side just because it's the other side. But it's what matters, it seems to me, are the people who are, or the body that is responsible for setting the terms of value. And in that case, I would think it matters more that courage attached to the perfect guardians, not to the auxiliaries. And then also, I do wonder if again we might not think it is kind of important. This goes back to this issue about musical education and gymnastic, but especially the musical education, where I was trying to get you to think about what does it matter what popular musical culture is and so on, what kind of music we're fed by the entertainment industry and by the recording industry and by the advertising industry. What is that? How is that persuading us around these certain kinds of values? Well, I would think it does matter whether the general populace is courageous in this too, right? I would think it does matter whether you have a community of people who, at the level of their kind of popular ethos, preserve, the right kinds of ideas about what really is terrible, right? So I would think here, I think Socrates naming what courage is and the questions he poses are right on. I think Glaucon's answers are not right on. And I think, therefore, that we get a sort of mistaken image here. I think it would make much more sense to think about courage with the governors, the so-called perfect guardians, and the general population than it makes sense to associate it with the auxiliaries, the soldiers. But Glaucon has the opposite view. And I wanted to say one more thing about that. And just that word is, they're talking about saving the opinions periton denon, regarding the things that are denos. And just remember what the wonders were, what that word denos attached to when we read the second chorus of Sophocles' Antigone, right? We really had a sense there of what the wonders were. That was there. They were talking about nature and stuff like that. I'm sure there are other things that matter too, not just the ones there. But one of the things that was so striking to me, anyway, in reading that second chorus, was that idea of, about wonders, like that there are things that are almost they're superhuman. Doesn't make them supernatural in a way, because we're sort of talking about natural. But the idea was that there are realities that go beyond, whose importance and whose reality goes beyond just sort of human perceptions and human world and human values and so on. And so the idea was, do you recognize any kind of authority higher than simple human will? Right? Is there something higher than human mastery, something to which we are answerable? And that's where, again, I've quoted this thing, or misquoted it a few times. If he honors the gods of the earth and the justice of the gods he has confirmed by oath high as his city, but no city has he with whom dwells dishonor and recklessness or something like that, right? Like that discussion of the wonders ended with that idea of saying, what matters is that you preserve the right opinion about what things are denos, right? And preserving that opinion isn't a matter of a theoretical concept. It's a matter of living in a way that is oriented towards recognizing your answerability to these higher values. Now, moderation. Moderation is a thing we talk about, that it more or less means, do feelings of pleasure and pain rule you, or are you on top of that? Can you hold your path straight when something pleasing is offered to you, or do you have to give up everything for the sake of getting that pleasure? So we think of moderation as like, can you handle your pleasures? Do you keep your drinking in a reasonable amount? That sort of thing. Can you limit how much dessert you eat? That, etc. How much sleep you want to get. But so the discussion of moderation is a little bit more complicated, especially when they get to the issue of specifically of the city. But when they first sort of define it, it's kind of that's sort of good. This is from 430E to 431B. So first of all, Socrates says it's like a kind of a chord and harmony, a symphonia and harmonia. He says it's a 430E. He says, moderation, I said, is surely a certain kind of order, cosmos tis, a certain kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires. Right. So, that's what I was just saying. Like, do you have your desires in order? Do you have yourself in order with respect to your desires? Do you have control over them? Right? I mean, control over your desires. I guess that's the most straightforward way to name the basic phenomenon that we usually are naming when we talk about someone being moderate, or when we talk about practicing moderation. But there's more subtlety to it than that. Anyway, Socrates says here, so, we're talking about the thing that comes up when people say someone is stronger than himself. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, you say, well, I really wanted that piece of cake, but I restrained myself, right? There you can see that you're being stronger than yourself, because it's you who wanted the cake, but you didn't do it because you restrained yourself. So this you that was doing the restraining was stronger than this you that wanted. So that's the sense in which you're stronger than yourself, right? Now, I think it's a pretty everyday experience, and so that's a very familiar phenomenon. Socrates then says an interesting thing there. He says, "Isn't the phrase 'stronger than himself' ridiculous?" The geloion is the word. Laughable, I guess, is what he says. Maybe ridiculous. What does he mean? Why does he say that? What does he mean by that? Does he mean that he thinks it's wrong to say that? I don't think so. I don't think he means that. But I think he's actually going to draw your attention to something a little bit odd about that. And so he says, "For of course the one who's stronger than himself would also be weaker than himself, and the one who's weaker than himself would also be stronger. The same himself is referred to in all of them." Yeah, I mean, so there's quite an interesting point there. I think the first reason that there's something kind of funny about that language is because you can say about yourself two sentences that contradict each other. I am weaker than myself. I am stronger than myself. And, usually you can't say about something that it's both P and not P, something and also the opposite of that. But the very notion of being stronger than yourself, it's one thing to be stronger than someone else. If I'm stronger than someone else, I'm not weaker than that someone else, right? Those would have to be different. But if you're stronger than yourself, you also have to be weaker than yourself. And that does, when you start thinking about that does seem pretty weird. So what does that show you? I mean, at the very least, it shows you that you are not a seamless uniformity. That the very nature of the you, of yourself, is that you're kind of multiple. In a sense, there are different yous. But it's also the same you. It's you who desires, and it's you who's controlling that. So there's our attention is drawn here to a pretty profound observation about ourselves, right? That we are not uniform, and yet in our differences we're not just different things, right? Something about the nature of the person is that we're kind of at odds with ourselves. And that, even right there, that should remind you a little bit of Heraclitus talking about the back-turning harmony, right? Differing with itself, it agrees with itself. Right? We really notice this idea of a kind of tension, but that meant that a thing agrees with itself. It is what it is, only as a certain kind of self-differing. That notion way back there, we're now seeing a version of that is how you have to think about what it is to be a self or a soul or a person. And it's interesting, therefore, that Socrates began this exact thing by saying, it's a certain kind of harmonia, right? The very word that Heraclitus used, palintropos harmoniae. Anyway, I'll just read the next little paragraph. So Socrates says, this speech looks to me as if it wants to say that concerning the soul, in the same human being, there's something better and something worse. And we call that person stronger than himself when the better part is master over the worse. And we call that person weaker when the inferior multitude masters the better part. Inferior multitude, why? Well, because there are lots of things about you that want to go in different ways. Like you want to have some cake, you want to have this, you want to have that. And the question is whether really you can sort of hold yourself together through all those divergent things. Let me actually, so just think about that language, hold yourself together. Like, in other words, you as a self are not automatically one in a strong sense. In some sense, you're one because it's you who wants all those things, but you're just all over the place. So being one in the strong sense of being a kind of unified, coherent person is actually a kind of an accomplishment. It's not the naturally occurring thing. That's part of you handling yourself well as a person, is that you've sort of made yourself someone who is the same you, So think about this. Can you keep a promise? You say on a certain day you will do something. You say to someone on a certain day, you say, I'll do that for you tomorrow. Do you do it the next day? Like, can you still be tomorrow the person that today you said you were going to be? That doesn't automatically happen. But many of us are that person. But that's because we make ourselves be that person, right? It is actually something we do to hold ourselves as a unity, to be a one, to be a coherent someone. And again, think of another example, like just sort of at the level of distraction. This isn't so much about promising, it's about you carrying out an activity. Can you sit down and do your studying, or do you start thinking about something, but then you have an itchy head, so you scratch your head, and then you get thirsty, so you get a drink, and then there's a sound out the window, and so you look out there, and then a friend calls you, and you go there, and no thing holds you. You go from this to that, to that, to that, to that. Are you someone who is just pushed and pulled around by whatever pops up in front of you? I mean, I doubt that anybody listening to this is exactly that. I mean, probably anybody who can listen to this has already done a pretty substantial job of being able to pull themselves together. But I bet you can also imagine ways in which, maybe sometimes you kind of tend towards that, find it harder to hold your attention together, find it harder to stay focused, and learn, let me not use the word learning yet, concentrating, staying attached is a matter of learning. It's not just a natural thing. And like other things, it comes from a lot of practice. And it's a way of existing that you have to develop. Right? Anyway, so I'm trying to bring out a little bit of the general sense of kind of thinking of the person as a relationship to himself, as just to stick with the gender that's used in the text, right? But obviously it applies to hers and themselves and anybody else too. But I want to think about that idea that one is a relationship to oneself. One isn't just a single monolithic block, that we exist as a relationship to ourselves, and that can be more or less unified, right? And then also I want to bring out that sense then of the notion that the kind of core phenomenon we're dealing with is a kind of multitude. And the issue is whether and how that multitude is going to be lived out by the person as a kind of coherence or not. Anyway, so that's the little description of moderation. Notice once again, to make that point, I and Socrates had to turn to the individual first to make the point. So like they said they were going to try to use the, justice in the city to see justice elsewhere. But the point I've made so far is that wisdom, courage, moderation, like I really think you got to look at those things in the individual first to see what they even mean before you think about what they might mean in the city. And that's effectively what they do. Anyway, so he says, okay, now take a glance at our city. So he's already making it clear. You look at the person first before looking at the city. So it's going to be funny when a little bit later they're going to turn around and say, okay, now let's look at the individual soul, because we already had to do that. Anyway, and so here a couple of sort of tricky things come. Oh, actually, I want to add one more thing before I do this. There we talked, he talks about wisdom or moderation as mastery. And yes, that's true, that is commonly how we talk about moderation and so on. But notice also that there are kind of stronger and weaker versions of that. Like, yes, we would call a person, we would think you're doing a better job of moderating yourself if you can control your great desire to have another drink or eat more dessert or whatever else. That's right. But there's a step beyond that too, right? There's also a person who doesn't actually feel swept away by dessert and drink and whatever else, right? So, when you're in the situation of having to master your desires, that means your desires are kind of running away and there's a fight inside you. But what we would normally think of fuller moral, personal development as actually having kind of educated your desires such that you desire moderately. Like you're not just always pulled forcefully by those desires, but that the very way you feel about things has kind of been educated too. So I want to distinguish them between what I think is probably use the kind of word he uses, a more perfect form of moderation, which is actually being a moderate person, where you don't have to be mastering yourself. You just your desires have actually come in line with a good perspective. And I would differentiate that from the weaker form or the imperfect moderation, where you actually have to fight with yourself to do the moderate thing. And so you might say, actually, the one where you have to fight with yourself to do the moderate thing is more like the kind of weaker image of what's really happening in the person who is truly moderate, who doesn't particularly desire to go out and get wasted all the time. Right? And I wonder if that's why Socrates says the phrase stronger than himself and some other such phrases are used, as it were, as the tracks or the traces of it. And I wonder if that's what he means. I wonder if he means, being stronger than yourself is kind of, it's a weaker image of what true moderation would be, which would be really living and feeling and desiring kind of moderately. But you can see a kind of version of that when you actually work to get yourself under control. Anyway, that's a thought I will put in, but it's pretty important in the long run, but it's not so important for what we're going to do right now. But he says, okay, let's look at our young city. He says, if by moderate we mean that in which the better rules the weak, we'll say that the city is moderate. We'll say it is stronger than itself if the better is ruling over. He says, in our city, don't we want it to be the case that the desires in the common many are mastered by the desires and the prudence in the more decent few? Basically, what he says here is, okay, if we think about, if we now turn to the city and we think about moderation as the good, mastering the many desires that would run out in other directions and so on, which we're going to call the weaker or the worse here. He could say, and sort of has said, that in the person, it's when you have that relationship to yourself that's moderate. So that would be a moderate person. We could also say in the city that it would be when the better people, or the people who stand for the better values, control the people who have the worse ones. He kind of puts those together in a slightly confused way. And he basically says, won't the city be moderate if the ones who are moderate, who are stronger than themselves, rule the others? So if the moderation in the city will be if the moderate ones rule the immoderate ones. It seems like there's a little bit of confusion there. But I guess what it means by that is, again, thinking at the level of rules and laws, maybe people are immoderate and they would do lots of immoderate things. And so a moderate city will be one where the wise lawmakers, because they themselves are moderate in their values and so on, set rules for those people that say, you just going to want to go drink, but we're actually going to close the bars at 2 a.m. and you can't drink if your blood alcohol is over 0.08 and da-da-da-da-da. You can't have sex with children. You can't, whatever those other things are. So there are things people would do that would be acting on their desires that we would say, no, those are wrong. You shouldn't do those things. And so a good city will be one in which self-control that individuals might not have, in fact, rules over those non-self-controlled individuals. I mean, I think that's more or less how he's defining moderation in the city. But it does, and that there's some sense to that. Like, it's a way of saying why you would want your laws. When we talked about wisdom as being good counsel with respect to how the city as a whole would deal with itself, well, that would be part of its dealing with itself, right? Making good decisions about what the limits are in terms of how people are going to be allowed to fulfill their desires. And the point about these laws is we're not going to count on those people to just regulate themselves, and they often won't. They often personally would be immoderate, but we're going to say we're going to limit you. Right? It seems to me there's a lot of sense in that. That's a very powerful and worthwhile line of consideration, and especially when you're just thinking about what laws are about and what they might be for. But Socrates' account here also has that sort of other thing that says the moderate people will be the rulers of the immoderate ones. And this is another version of getting back into that kind of Spartan mentality, right? That says they're going to be the really good citizens and they should be the masters of the others. So I just want to draw your attention again to some of the ambivalence in the account here that comes from what I think is a kind of confusedly constructed account of what that moderation would be when you sort of say the ones who are stronger than themselves will be the ones who are stronger than the weaker ones, right? Which is essentially the account they give here. The more decent few will master the licentious multitude, basically. And then just one more thing about this. So right before 431e, so right at the end of 431d, Socrates says, "Oh, okay, and moreover, if there's any city in which the rulers and the ruled have the same opinion about who should rule, then it's this one, right? Or doesn't it seem so?" And Glaucon says, "Oh yeah, that's right." Well, really? Here he's saying the city we've just described, which seems to be the one in which, the decent few are masters of the licentious multitude. He's saying that's the one in which the rulers and the rules have the same opinion about who should rule. I would think he's just described the opposite. I would think that that's a situation in which the licentious multitude, right, most people would feel themselves to be ruled, and they wouldn't automatically have the view that those people should rule us, but they accept that they do because those people have force. Right? I would think, on the contrary, the situation in which the rulers and the ruled have the same opinion about who should rule would be when, you're talking about people who themselves hold a set of values, and they see their values reflected in the city and in the rulers and in whatever else. So I think the idea about a city in which the rulers and the rules have the same opinion about who should rule is a pretty powerful one. But I would think it points to a significantly different interpretation of what a city would look like than the one that they've actually just described here. And then anyway, so Socrates then says, well, isn't it the case here that what we've seen is that moderation is now different from courage and wisdom, because courage and wisdom seem to reside in a part, the governing body or the soldiers, whereas moderation seems to be something that is in the relationship between the parts. Well, that idea of the relationship between the parts is interesting, but in fact, as I already said about courage quite explicitly, I don't think that they've actually done a good enough analysis of how these things do reside in a part or do reside in the whole. So I think we should be kind of cautious about that one. Anyway, finally, justice, and this one's going to run from 432b to 434c. I'm just going to make a few points about this one. This is officially what we've been looking for. First, a weird one. Remember, I said at the beginning, like, you got to remember who's speaking and so on. And so far, everything we have been witnessing is Socrates' portrayal of a conversation he was having with Glaucon and so on, right? And Adeimantus and Thrasymachus and whatever. But remember, that whole thing is framed with Socrates at the beginning saying, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday, and it's a conversation of him talking to someone. We don't know to whom he's speaking. And he is narrating this conversation he had with Glaucon. So it's interesting here that Socrates says at 432d, presumably here, this looks like him just talking to the person he's telling the story to. He said, I caught sight of it and said. And so it's kind of interesting. This is a spot where Socrates, in his own voice now, saying here's where he saw what his version of seeing what justice is. And so then he goes on to say a couple of things. And so he says a thing here that's very interesting. He says, justice has been rolling around at our feet from the very beginning, and we couldn't see it. So we were actually quite ridiculous. So there's that notion of being ridiculous again that came up when he said stronger than itself and weaker than itself. But then he said, he points out this interesting phenomenon. He says, as men holding something in their hands sometimes seek what they're holding, right? It's like, I did this a couple of months ago. I left the house on my bicycle, and I rode down the street. And as I was riding down the street, I suddenly said, I forgot my glasses. I was so irritated because I was going to have to go home and get my glasses because I was going out to do some work and I wouldn't be able. I can't, I need them for reading. I can't read words on the page well enough without them. So I can't do my work. I got to go back and get them. And I went back and I thought I must have left them in the bathroom when I was having a shower or something like that. So I went to the bathroom and I was looking for them and I couldn't find them. And I happened to look up in the mirror and I was wearing them. And that was a pretty extreme case. That was a good example of being ridiculous. I had to laugh at myself after that happened. But that's a thing people do. And he says, we too didn't look at justice, but turned our gaze somewhere far off, which is also just perhaps the reason it escaped our notice. But it was close. It was just, rolling around at our feet, as he says. And it's for that reason that it escaped our notice. That's a great idea, that there are things that can escape your notice. Remember, Heraclitus said, nature loves to hide. So it's interesting to think about realities, maybe, the very nature of which is that they hide, or that they don't immediately present themselves as things for us to see, even though they are integral to our very reality, right? So that's what we got with that notion of nature loves to hide. And that's what happened with my glasses. I see through them. I don't look at them normally. And so consequently, even though they are an integral dimension of all of my seeing, I basically never see them, right? Glasses only work if they escape your notice. If you don't look at them, but see through them, right? And so he's noting that very interesting phenomenon. I'm not going to build much on it at the moment, but I want to just note it because I think it's such a powerful one. So then Socrates says, well, here's the thing I caught sight of that we should have been talking about all along. And he says that 433a, well, remember, it's basically going to be where we started. Remember that rule we set down at the beginning as to what must be done in everything when we're founding our city. Namely, each one must practice one of the functions of the city. That's what he says here. So I think it's really important. He's taking you back to the beginning of his attempt to derive where the city comes from. And he's taking you back to the things he was saying there, not the things that came up when Glaucon interrupted about the city nowadays, not the things that came up when Adeimantus interrupted and said, I don't like these stories we tell about the gods, they're really misleading, right? But he's going back to what he was trying to do when he was trying to say what the city really is and where it comes from. We need to go back to that basic sense of our inherent need to participate in a kind of collective endeavor. Remember, I think it was Adeimantus said at that point, maybe justice is somewhere to be found in the need these people have for each other. And I wonder if that was what we should have pursued there. So Socrates takes us back there. And so the first way he puts it is this. This is what justice is good, the principle of justice is going to be. Each one must practice one of the functions in the city. Just take that sentence by itself. Forget about everything else. Just take it by itself and think about that. I think that's a pretty powerful idea, right? That justice is, first in so much as it impinges upon you, like you're responsible for carrying out some of the city's work. It's not just you need to work in whatever sense you might define work and live in a city, that you're responsible for doing some work on behalf of the city. Being a citizen, basically, but in the way you carry out your work, you have to practice one of the functions of the city. And on the other hand, that's what you're responsible for. But that's also something about the justice for the person, right? If people can't do that, there's a sense in which they're being treated unjustly. If you aren't allowed to participate in the city's functioning, if, for example, you're a subject and not a citizen, or if for other reasons, like decision-making just happens and whatever else just happens in a way that doesn't let you get involved, then it seems like injustice is being done towards you. So this seems pretty powerful. Like the story of justice basically is ending with this principle that is basically another version of the very principle he started with in trying to talk about why we have societies. So that seems very powerful to me. And then he goes on to say a little bit about what that is. And he says, and this is one of the places where translations can be really misleading. So you've got to be careful with it. But what he says is, justice is ta autou pratein, right? Doing the things of oneself, doing the things of yourself. They translate it minding your own business. It's not wrong, it's not bad, and there's a reason for doing it, but it can be misleading because, minding your own business makes it seem like keep out of the affairs of others. But what he has literally just said when he says practicing one of the functions in the city, and what he said when he began his account, and he says this is the same as that, is that your very job is to work for others, right, and to contribute to a collective thing. So your job is to do your own thing, be your carpenter or whatever it is you do, or be a guardian. But in doing that, you are doing the work of everybody. So the language of minding your own business is extremely misleading, right? That makes it sound like this kind of somebody who focuses on the rights of individuals and says, like, you should do your own thing and leave everybody else on their own, and you should be given your own private protected space and so on. This is pretty much the opposite of that, right? Minding your own business means taking responsibility for your affairs, which are intrinsically affairs that matter to everybody else, right? So but in any case, so you got to do your own thing, that the things of yourself. And it says, and not being a busybody. That's carrying on that idiom of like sticking to your own thing and not meddling in other people's affairs and so on. But what it really is me pollu pragmonen, which really means not trying to do much. I mean, it's more like not trying to be a jack of all trades, not trying to be involved in much. And, I think the point is, if you remember that opening discussion where I said kind of Adeimantus seemed to lose the thread right off the bat, the idea was like, is it better for people where you do the farming for everybody and somebody else does the house building for everybody, or should you try to do farming and build your own house and make your own shoes? And the point there was, so you should do your own thing and not try to do many things, right? And that's basically what this line says here when it says you should mind your own business. When it's translated as you should mind your own business and not be a busybody. So I'm almost done here. So then I want to. So there, we're getting a pretty cool account of what justice is. Notice that there's going to be a pretty strong similarity between what justice is and what they've just described moderation as. In a way, if moderation really was unanimity about what's ruling and what should be ruled, like that really does mean moderation in the city is going to be all the different parts of the city kind of functioning coherently in a harmony, as he says. And that seems pretty close to all the people in the city doing their part, right? So when we get to justice here, it doesn't exactly sound like we have found another thing. We could make some sense of what wisdom was, although that actually looked a lot like moderation too, since it was making good judgments about how the city should be run. So they're pretty similar. We saw what courage was, and that looked pretty similar too, because it seemed like everybody, at least as I interpreted, everybody had to be holding the same views about what's terrible. And then we got moderation, which was all these things. Like, were these different parts actually? They had different definitions: be of good counsel, preserve the view about what is terrible, have good attitude towards desire, and so on. But if you think about those at the level of the city, if you think about the reality of any one of them, is it different from the reality of any other? I actually think maybe not very much. So it really starts to seem like this wasn't a list of 4 different things. You can see this one and then this one beside it and this one, but it actually starts to seem more like you're looking at one thing and noticing it from 3 different angles on it. Now, is justice a 4th angle on that? There, it doesn't seem so clear. That initial methodological point about we're going to find these 4 things and we'll look for the missing one really starts to look misleading to me. And then it's going to get even more misleading when you look at what Socrates actually says. Or the misleading character of it is going to be even more apparent when you look at what Socrates says next. He says, so he goes back and addresses that, this is the 4th one business. And he says at 433b, well, in my opinion, I said, after having considered moderation, courage, and prudence, funny, phronesis, but we were talking about wisdom before. Now we're talking about prudence. So notice the words are slipping around a little bit here. But anyway, but after considering those, he says, this is what's left over in the city, justice. It provided the power by which all those others came into being. Well, that's an important point, and I think it's maybe a right point, right? That this is in a way the principle of the whole city as such. There is no city without this. This is where cities came from. We saw that at the beginning of book 2. So I think it makes sense to say this is the principle that all of these come from. And in a way, it's the principle that all of them are answering to as well. In as much as we were looking at these things as the ways the city is going to be excellent, they're the ways that the city is going to do the city's thing well. It's going to be good as a city. And that means they're the ways that the city is going to be good at living up to this principle. And so we can say this is both the principle of the city, and we could really say justice in the city will be when the city in its realized form lives up to its founding principle. And that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a pretty powerful point. But the idea that it's the power by which those others came into being seems very much at odds with saying, it's the 4th in a series of 4 different things. You can say, I have the sight of a tree, I have the sight of a house, and I have the sight of a person, and then I have the power of sight. So you had 3 sights and the power of sight. That wasn't the 4th of the same kind of thing. It's like Sesame Street. One of these things doesn't belong with the other. So it seems pretty clear when he says this about it being a power that there is something really wrong with the way they were talking about. You're just going to look for 3 and then find the 4th and so on. And I think this whole thing again should cast some doubt on that initial question. Why did they pick these 4? And they're good. They're a good 4. And as I said, they do all seem to me to say the same thing in the end almost. So interesting. But it's worth asking, what about others? Like what about piety, for example, which is one that has come up sometimes. So why isn't that one of the things here? And what would that be if it were important? Maybe others. I think that's the basic thing I wanted to get at. I wanted to talk about these notions of wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice in the city in this short section, because it seems to me the things that are said here are actually pretty smart, and they're very helpful to completing the thing that we started with in book 2, which was trying philosophically to grasp what the political community is, what human community is, where society comes from, and indeed what justice and so on are. And these few pages here add a lot to our attempt to say what it is that makes up a city. One last thing. There are still a few other pretty interesting points in here, but I'm not going to get into them. I just want to get into the last point, the point he ends this section with about justice in the city. And so this is at 434a. He says, okay, so see if you have the same opinion as I do. Like if a carpenter tries to be a shoemaker, or a shoemaker tries to be a carpenter, or even if somebody's trying to do both of those, that's not going to really harm the city very much, is it? No. So, we've said before, like realistically, you're usually going to do one thing. But it's not a big deal if, in a certain way, it's not a big deal which you do. Like, it's good to do the thing you're suited to do, like that you got an aptitude for or whatever, presumably do the thing you like. But it's not going to be a big deal if you choose a different craft. In fact, it's not even that big a deal if you try to do two. And maybe it's not even that big a deal if you don't do them all that well, but he doesn't say that. But maybe you could even do two. That's not much of an issue. So where is the real important thing about making sure you're doing the right kind of thing? Well, right after that he says, well, but I suppose when one of the craftsmen or some other kind of moneymaker, inflated by wealth, strength, or something else, tries to get into the category of the warriors, or one of the warriors who's not, perfect, tries to get into the role of advisor and guardian, right? Or if somebody's trying to do all that stuff, that's when this change in them and this meddling are the destruction of the city. Now, he says, that's when I imagine it's also your opinion that, right? So, Socrates is not straightforwardly asserting this. He's saying, oh, so probably you think this, right? Probably the reason that Glaucon would think that would be for those same kinds of Spartan sensibilities I've referred to before, right? Because he really believes these are, fundamentally different kinds of people, and you don't sort of want these classes to mix or whatever. You don't want people to get above their station or something like that, right? But it actually seems to me there is a pretty powerful point being made here by Socrates that's pretty significant. And it goes back to this issue of, what the guardians, both in the strong proper sense of guardian, namely those who are craftsmen of freedom and who care and love for the city and exercise wise counsel, and the other sense of guardian, which is the auxiliaries, the soldiers. It's important to think about the difference between the role those people have and the role people do engaged in all the other crafts have. And as he says, there's something is wrong when the person who's a craftsman or a moneymaker wants to take on one of those other roles. Why is that? I think the provocative and thought-provoking idea there is precisely this idea that, when the role of the guardian, properly speaking, is care of the whole. It's a very particular kind of non-partisan role. If it's being done well, if it's being done properly, right? You really have to be caring for this whole thing. And so in that sense, it's quite the opposite of something done for reasons of personal gain. And so, you think, yeah, maybe there's something wrong if somebody who's invested in money making thinks, oh, I want to be president. He says, or other craftsmen. And I guess I'm not, there again, I think, well, one of the points this whole thing has been premised on is that there are really different kinds of things. And so you don't automatically want the orientation that's appropriate to certain kinds of crafts to be just stuck into governing. I guess, and so I think, but why would he mark that one out? And I think of the thing he says in the Apology, where he talks about the crafts. When he says, people do these crafts and they know one thing, and they kind of figure that because they know that one thing, they're good at everything. He says here, there's something wrong with people who really should be working at those things, trying to be in charge, and it seems to me there are some pretty, that's really worth thinking about, right? That the idea being that the role of governing requires a very different kind of thing than the role of, or than what you're doing when you're plumbing or whatever, and especially what you're doing when you're money making. Because remember, in book 1, he's distinguished the craft proper from money making, different things. And then also, he talks about, he talks about a similar problem though, just between the governors and the warriors. And I mean, it seems to me I can see why someone might say, yeah, you don't want a general trying to be president. What you don't want somebody who's part of the soldiery to think, oh, I'm going to try to run the country, right? And it's not because any individual person has some inherent flaw that makes them unable to be there. The point is rather the values and the skills and the ways of thinking that are appropriate to these different things are kind of intrinsically different. And I think that's, one of the strongest ones about that is the difference between the auxiliaries, the military, and the guardians proper. Right? The thing that they were saying, and I've stressed this repeatedly in book 2, was that, the thing about guardians, the thing about that whole reality as a very familiar functional part of states, is that these are people who fight on behalf of their state, not because it's good, but because it's their state, right? So it is it's an orientation, or it's a way of life built around, that sort of Paul Marx's view of justice, right? Be good to your friends and hurt your enemies. But that's not, maybe that makes for good soldiers. That doesn't make for good rulers of cities, right? That doesn't make for a wise counsel, moderation, and all those other things, right? So this, the thing he's saying here is really just another way of saying, it seems to me, there really is a fundamentally different, a functional difference, like a difference in meaning between what kind of thing you're doing if you're involved in crafts, which is a highly laudable thing. It's what the city is built on in the way, but there's a difference between that, between being a soldier, and between being a governor. And it's really important not to confuse those kinds of tasks. And you don't want a person who's really doing this kind of thing trying to do this thing, right? So as I said, I don't think that means about any given person that there's some natural reason you couldn't do this or that, right? It's not that. It's that the meaning of these kinds of activities is radically different. And there is a real problem in a state or in a city when the fundamental difference between those kinds of occupations is ignored and lost. So anyway, so I wanted to bring that thought around last, and just to think about the problems of people oriented towards money making, trying to be president, or soldiers trying to run the country, that kind of thing. To think about the sort of point he's making there. Okay, so we'll leave it there. And now we're going to move on to the last part of book 4, which is really going to talk about the nature of your soul, a theme I've raised already a couple of times. We're going to pick up on some of the things we talked about before, when we were talking about gymnastic education and the education of the soul and that kind of stuff, and education through music. But I'm going to get you to begin, to go back and look at the very beginning of book 2, when Glaucon initially poses his question to Socrates. So we're going to look at that, and then we're going to go on to look at this stuff. Okay.